Well, comrades and fellow workers, one of the difficulties when you deal with the anarchist group is trying to find out which particular anarchist group it is, because Mr. Hines and his 57 varieties didn't have a look at. So it's sometimes quite difficult, and I hope I'm not attacking a specific brand of anarchism that my friend here doesn't have to share. I've got a hold of the Black Flag, which is their newspaper, of course, and I've had a go at it as much as I can to try and make sure I don't make those mistakes. If I make a mistake, I'm sure my opponent tonight will put me correct. Now, recently in Glasgow, we had a meeting called Why We Oppose the Anarchists, and of course we had a variety of those anarchists turning up. Some who were in favour of democracy, some who were opposed, some who were in favour of trade unionists, some who were opposed, some were in favour of syndicalists, some were in favour of direct action, and so on and so on. And of course, one of the other brands that we had is that peculiar brand of Spanish history where they always laud the golden age in Barcelona. And I rather imagine that that may be the tack my opponent will take this evening, but time will tell. I do notice an article on that specific period of history, at least one, with constant references to it in the Black Flag. What I intend to do as a spokesman for the Socialist Party this evening is deal with it in basically three ways. What is a revolution? Because I think that's absolutely essential that we all know what each other's talking about, and if there's any doubt about it, we can at least clear that one out of the way at the beginning. And secondly, why it is that the organisation I represent, the Socialist Party, is opposed to all those different groups that come under a sort of umbrella called anarchists. And thirdly, and more importantly, to the real point of the whole discussion this evening, I hope, that is, how can a real revolution be achieved? So to the first item, namely what is a revolution, let us discount immediately all references to it in the popular press and the TV and so on. And every advertiser tells you it's a revolution in food, there's a revolution in shoes, there's a revolution in all sorts of ladies' underwear, and so on and so on. And every political pundit talks about South America, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, one president, and Thursday, Friday, Saturday, another one, and that's a revolution. People talk of Marxist revolutions, of the Chile Allende revolution, I suppose following that, because there's another change, the ITT revolution in Chile. In other words, any change at all is looked upon as a revolution. I'm not going to use that in any way. I'm not going to use it in that sense at all. I'm not going to talk about punk revolution or a hippie revolution or a sexual revolution. What I'm going to talk about, as far as I'm concerned, what the term means in politics is a basic transformation in the whole basis of society. And as such, we recognise certain basic changes. The break-up of old kinship society, chattel slavery, feudalism, and modern-day capitalism. These were basic economic changes. In turn, of course, the whole political atmosphere and the whole political power structure changed along with it. So when the socialist talks about a revolution, he means something very specific. He or she means something very specific. We mean a change in the basic economic relationships in society. Very briefly, and I don't want to labour the point, but if anybody's got any doubts on it, we've got the figures here. Roughly, we can say in the modern world, with few exceptions, the world is divided into two classes. As far as the modern industrialised society is concerned, that is absolutely true. On the one hand, a very small handful of fortunate men and women who own all the factories and the land, all the means of communication and transport and commerce. And the vast majority of mankind, all the men and women who produce all the wealth of the world, but own very little of the means of producing and distributing wealth. As I say, if anyone doubts that, I can give you figures worldwide or recent figures, the Royal Commissions and wealth and so on. Roughly, we can say that it splits up something less than 10% of the population own 90% of the whole world's wealth, all the natural resources and all the commercial and transport undertakings. In other words, socialists see the world today as a capitalist one. That is divided between two groups, between two classes. Further, we see that the whole purpose of production in this modern society is not to satisfy need, but in order to sell on a world market. Further, we see that all the political superstructure that's based upon those economic relationships all over the world, whether in the so-called Free West or the enslaved East, or this bloc or that bloc, or the North or the South, or however the political pundits like to put it, all over the world, from the North Pole to the South Pole, from Siberia to the Rockies. A worldwide system with our government institutions that represent the owning class. We see a state machine that represents the interests of the real owners of the world today. So it's against that background that we would ask you to consider how can a real revolution be achieved. Now, the whole basis of the power of the owning class is in their ownership. And the way that they protect that ownership is by their laws. There are no divine laws that says this river should belong to this man or woman to the exclusion of all others. There's no divine law that says this means of production and distribution should be owned. To find out how ownership came about is the job of the historian. It's the job of looking back and seeing how it came about. I don't intend to give a lecture on that. In the main, it came about with murder. It came about with trickery. It came about with straight theft in many instances, especially when you consider in this country the Enclosures Act, the Highland Clearances, and so on. Suffice to say, however, that this owning class, no matter how stupid they may be, no matter how ill-informed they may be politically, are very property conscious. And these institutions of government, whether in the so-called communist bloc or the so-called democratic bloc or the fascist bloc or whatever, the whole purpose of governments is to protect that class ownership. Any attempt to even endanger it is ruthlessly dealt with. And it's here, of course, that the socialist takes a complete departure from any group of anarchists. It may be that some anarchists will speak about a future society very like that the socialists would speak of, about the abolition of property, about the abolition of classes, and so on. But some of them would. But even those who have that viewpoint, nevertheless have got the viewpoint that the real enemy to the attainment of that is, of course, this state machine. And it's no accident that Black Flag, rather like a lot of anarchist organisations and a lot of left-wing organisations, one of whom I've debated here, see the state as the bogeyman. And it's all about fights, either between the strikers in France, in this case, or some punk in Belfast at a concert, and the policeman is a guy with a heavy truncheon, and there's a noble anarchist or a noble freedom lover having a hell of a bad time of it. And all of their propaganda and all of their efforts are put towards trying to direct workers' energies towards seeing this bogeyman of the state. And none of the ones that I've read, and I may be unfortunate not to have read very much of it, but in all of the anarchist stuff that I've read, he never anywhere put the emphasis on the real bogeyman and the real cause of the problems, namely the class ownership of the means of producing and distributing wealth. And because of that, they then take another step back from their position, because it is our view that not only do we have capitalism because of the historical growth, the means of production and methods of production, we also have a working class that support that viewpoint. It's not a case here of the world's working class, all these wonderful people who produce everything and distribute everything, having this terrible contract put upon them. On the contrary, in most developed capitalist countries, it's a case that they actively support it. In other words, the world's working class take the viewpoint that this set of social relationships, owners and non-owners, buyers and sellers, stolen from and thieves, is the only possible social arrangement. It's a popular misconception It always has been, it is, and it always will be. Now, of course, it's true that amongst that world's working class, because of the problems they've got to face, they look for all sorts of solutions. And the history of anarchism is that where it had greatest support, in the main, if you looked at it in Italy, France, and especially in Spain, it was usually in Russia, it was usually where there was a backward agrarian economy. Because basically, historically, the case for anarchism is the case of the peasant, the case of the small proprietor. The case for socialism, on the other hand, is the case for a working class, worldwide working class, who are dealing with the real modern industrial world. Now, the Socialist Party therefore stresses in all its efforts at trying to put forward the case for socialism, and you can search back through all the socialist standards, and it'd be a rather strange one in which you didn't see some reference, in some cases articles, on the importance of understanding. Because the socialists take the viewpoint that what's called for to bring this transformation is a revolution in the ideas. That people's perception of this buying and selling system has got to be changed. And I'll deal with that a little later on in the last part, how can we achieve this transformation. But suffice to say, if I looked at any of the three issues in the supplement that they have produced, and various other pieces of anarchist literature, what you would find is a rather ambiguous viewpoint in regard to how you can achieve this, and having achieved it, what exactly it would be. Because we don't agree on that. Nor can I find specifically in this Black Flag, the actual group we're dealing with this evening, can I find anything really concrete about it. But what I can see is some rather strange attitudes. For instance, in an article entitled News from Barcelona, what they do is they have a look at an exhibition put on there in the 50th anniversary of the Spanish Civil War. And the commentator, of course, looks back on this as a wonderful period where we had this anarchist revolution. Well, not in a developed form, but at least in some sort of form. And there were rather strange ideas all through it, but one of them that struck me as particularly peculiar, and it might seem a small point, but I think it's very symptomatic, is their attitude towards humour. Here's one. It's talking about the exhibition, and it says, there are moments when this can be macabre. For example, at one stage, a CNT commando found an old, well-dressed German gentleman with spectacles in a house outside Barcelona. They were about to take him off to be shot. Naturally, what would you do if you see an old guy with a well-dressed, especially a German, taking him for a fascist boss? Before somebody recognised him, it turned out to be Max Necklin, I don't get the name here, the greatest historian of the anarchist movement. This is his comment. I imagine they had a good laugh about it afterwards. Well, it's a good job they recognised him, isn't it? Mind you, that might have been a good laugh as well. So, I mean, there's this attitude all through it, that, for instance, in the dispute with the railway workers in France, they talk about we have to be more militant, we have to get more direct action, and I quote, as far as I can see approvingly, that what you should do in a question of a strike is break up property. One of them is that you should cut the railway lines, you should blow up signal boxes, and so on. I don't know how the anarchist would feel about that if he was hurtling in a train to Paris Nord and the signal box put him in the same line as a one coming into Paris Nord. Whether he would think direct action was such a good thing there. But nevertheless, what you'll get here is a thing that occurs all the time on what is ambiguously called the left wing. That is the losers' wing, the people who will permanently be in opposition. What they say is, we'll shake a fist at orthodoxy. We'll throw our thunderbolts at authority. But it's all rather pathetic. It has never got them anywhere. I mean, in 1936, they were on the verge of this great revolution, which, of course, as we all know, they didn't achieve. Instead of that, fascist dictatorship came about. And despite all the direct actionists that were in Spain, and according to this there was millions of them, during that time they didn't manage to knock off Generalissimo Franco. It's true they blew up bus shelters, killed tourists, and blew up beaches and Christ knows all what, but they never managed to get the man that presumably they would have looked upon as being a feather in their cap. Naive romantics that they are. So we take our viewpoint here that the real issue that intelligent men and women of the working class should be addressing themselves to is not knocking over policemen's hats in Belfast or laughing about how they nearly shot an anarchist historian. But what we should be doing instead is say, why is it that members of the working class who produce all the wealth of the world live in terror, live in poverty, live in insecurity? Why is this? That here in a technically advanced society, well beyond anybody could have dreamt of in the last century, well beyond the members of the Communist Party and the Anarchists and all the other funny initials that existed in Spain in 1936 and so on, a world we could hardly imagine, a technical dream world, as it were, a world of communications, satellites and all the rest of it. And yet, we cannot solve a medieval problem almost, the one of war and poverty and famine. Now, the reason the socialists would say is not because of bad, crooked policemen or bad, crooked politicians or people selling one another up pathways and all the rest of it, but instead, the basic society, the fact that we have this thing called, this institution, this relationship called private ownership. And that brings me to the most important bit, namely, how do we bring about a real revolution? How can we achieve it? It's all very well decrying the fact that people starve while food is destroyed. It's all very well talking about the horrors of a bomb to come, but I mean, we can all just have a fight and mutter into it and say, what a terrible thing. But the socialists take the viewpoint that something can be done. We take the viewpoint that far from it just being a case of throwing a few marbles under policemen's police horses' hooves, I was going to say policemen had hooves there, at demonstrations. What you can do is a real practical thing. It'll not get you in the newspapers, of course. It'll not get you in the committee of 100. It'll not get you in the angry brigade. It'll not get you up in a murder charge. Or it'll not get you thousands of people sending you Christmas cards as you're incarcerated in a jail in Spain or South America and fight martyrdom and all the rest of it. What you could do instead is address yourself to this real world and the real power structure. The working class today not only produce and distribute all the wealth of the world, they also organise its production and distribution. It is members of the working class who wear all the uniforms, the privates and the generals. In the main, the armed forces are made up of the working class. Even the police force, they're not recruited from Eton and Harrow. They're recruited, they come from the Gorbals and Islington and so on. That men and women of the working class run this society from top to bottom. Now, the socialists take the viewpoint that what's called for is a growth of socialist knowledge. We think there are two agencies working here about how that will lead to a real revolution. The first one, and the most important one, is how capitalism develops itself. Capitalism, as it develops, makes more and more untenable. Nobody can hold on to old ideas about people are starving because there's not enough to go round, when you can switch on the box. Not a question in 1904, the Socialist Party was formed and a speaker standing at a street corner. Now at a turn of a switch, they can see people starving and they can see the Lord Mayor's banquet. They can see great technical advances and people living in substandard housing. I mean, you don't need a telly for that, you just need to look out the window. In other words, what's happening is the experience of the working class have driven them to reject old solutions. Political parties have come into being and disappeared. Political movements have come into being and disappeared. Amongst them, a variety of anarchist movements. Now, we take the viewpoint that change, that changes in the method of production, more and more make it the case that the superstructure, the political ideology, no longer can contain it. That even the best brains of capitalism sit and ponder Frankenstein problems. Like, how can you possibly deal with this food mountain? This is a real problem. Many of these economists would probably pray for some terrible Holocaust to come about to get those food mountains down. And that's not just a whim. Apparently the cotton growers way back in the 30s in the USA seriously proposed introducing the boll weevil into the cotton fields to decimate the crops in order to keep up prices. Now, of course, in the Guardian this week, I see one of these experts telling us quite blithely that old idea of giving butter to the Salvation Army to hand out is not a very good idea. They called it lunacy. It goes on here about the real effort, they say, the Minister of Agriculture, is burn it. Burn it. That's the best way to get rid of all these surpluses. Burn it. Well, let's face it, it's pretty logical that. You're producing for a market. The market can't consume it, the people can't afford it. We'll just burn it. That way the market will be there and we can start producing again. Now, that is the insanity of it. It becomes more apparent even to orthodox people who think along orthodox lines, that this society is splitting asunder by its own contradictions. Now, the socialists say the only answer, the only way to bring about that transformation in the basis of society is by transforming the ideas of the people who support capitalism, the working class. I mean, it's all very well saying the capitalist class support it, but to hell with them. We're not going to ask them to organise to bring about a society that will do away with their wealth and privilege. Our remarks, our case, is only addressed to the working class. And to go back to that Spain, think of the difference of what was written there last year or this year, I'm not too sure, with what appears in this month's Socialist Standard, which puts out an article that appeared in the Socialist Standard in 1936 about the very thing that this triumphs on, about how wonderful it all was. And it goes on, I'll just very briefly put a wee bit out of it. The agony of Spain is only a matter of concern for the capitalists of other nations if any of them have interest involved, or if there's any prospect of gain by fishing in troubled waters. To the rest, it is a matter of minor importance that thousands of Spanish workers are losing their lives just because landowners in the Catholic Church want to keep intact their privilege to rob the wealth producers of the products of their toil. Now, that was written at the time, 1937. It saw the conflict not as a battle between liberty and totalitarianism, but a battle between the old landowners, the church and other landowners, and the new burgeoning bourgeoisie. Now, it's taken, 50 years to the death of the dictator, but look at Spain now. Is it not one of the most developing industrial countries in Europe? You'll see the adverts for their cars and all the rest of it. Washing machines, Christ knows all what. They're right in the world market now. They've been taken out of the old medieval thing. Now, that was what was going on then, to benefit one section of the owners against another. Now, as it happened, the landowners and the church and so on, the finance group, won against the industrialists and retarded the development of industry in that country. To such an extent it became the main industry was, I think probably still is, was tourism, a cheap holiday, a cheap bevy. But now Spain is into the world markets. Now Spain is facing the same problem as the rest of capitalism. But so far from being romantic, millions of workers died in that conflict. A bitter, bitter conflict, one of the first modern wars, in the sense of guerrilla warfare and so on. Fighting in the streets with citizens in the front line. But rather than romanticise that, what we take the viewpoint is say learn from it. Learn from it that the only step forward is the step proposed there in that article in 1937. Yet, in the advanced countries, at any rate, the workers produce and distribute the wealth upon which all live. While the capitalists control the wealth, they use their position to live in idleness and so on, luxury. It goes on to say, the only solution is for the world's working class to take back that means of production from them. So we propose, before my opponent starts, just to quickly go over where we differ from them. We say the cause of all working class problems today is the way society is organised. Production for profit with its class ownership is the cause of all modern social problems. The answer lies not in attacking an effect of it, its authoritarian fist. The answer lies in socialist knowledge of organising politically to take that machine off them, not for workers to go up with broken bottles and razors and chains in the streets of Glasgow against nuclear weapons, but instead to capture that state machine. Capitalism cannot last when the majority of the working class reject it. So the Socialist Party entered the political arena in 1904 saying socialism's a practical alternative. Now, of course, history has shown that we were far too optimistic, because here, after all, we're in 1987, 80 odd years later. And in the sense that the ownership is even more entrenched in the hands of a smaller and smaller group, we have failed. But in the sense that our case and our analysis has proven correct, as opposed to the madmen of the left wing and the anarchists who tried to recruit workers for various bloodbaths, our case has been proved correct. It's the sane, logical one. And you ignore that sane, logical case at the peril of your very existence. The only answer is for men and women of the working class to organise politically and democratically to organise a new society.
I'd like to thank Dick Donnelly from the Socialist Party for that. For Albert Meltzer to reply.
Well, I'm sorry if I don't look very naive or romantic. I don't even look like a peasant. I forgot to bring me white smock. But I'll do my best. I noticed that a comic Donnelly started off by attacking the anarchists because there's 57 varieties. There's so many of them, so various, you couldn't tell which the difference. And by that, I take it, he meant that when we take socialists, there's only one type of socialist. There's only, wherever you come across the word socialist, there must only be one type. Whether they're carrying out mass murders in Eastern Europe, whether they're extermination camps in Eastern Europe, whether there's reformism in Western Europe, whatever, there's only one socialist according to him. Because he rejects the fact that there could possibly be 57 varieties of socialism. But, of course, we know that all these different, this 5,700 different types of socialists have got one thing in common. They've got a number of things in common. One thing in common regards anarchism. They always insist on one thing. The anarchists must take responsibility, not only for everybody who calls himself an anarchist, but even for people who don't call themselves anarchists, but are referred to as by anarchists by the press or whatever. But they themselves are only prepared to take any responsibility for actually signed up, paid up members of their own particular group. And that goes to the Communist Party, goes to the Trotskyists, to the Maoists, and to the SPGP. And I'm surprised he was a bit audacious in referring to the Butter Mountain, because that's the most significant thing of what he said as regards the SPGP. The original, I don't know if it's the original idea, but the first apologist for the Butter Mountain came actually from a person whose father was a member of the SPGP, who'd been a member of the SPGP herself, who understood everything about the SPGP, had given speeches equally as eloquent as his, and had passed over to becoming a Labour minister, Miss Joan Lester. Now, how is it that somebody who obviously knew as much about socialism as it's put as he does, was able to kid herself that Butter Mountain could solve anything, the Labour Party reformism could solve anything? Doesn't it seem that there's some something lacking in the elite itself. That perhaps it might be the case that it isn't the fact that the working class is deluded, but the fact that socialists of every type, whatever they call themselves, always consider themselves a cut above the working class. They all think that they can give the working class a leadership, they can tell the working class what to do, and they never have to support the working class. They simply step aside and say, well, you know, all this is quite wrong, we must give you an eloquent speech explaining socialism instead. Now, that to me is not a way to achieve a revolution. And you notice that throughout his speech, very eloquent, he kept saying, we're going to come to the end to how to achieve a revolution. And he kept dodging it. He kept saying, we're coming to this at the finish. We're going to tell you how to achieve a revolution. And what we've finished is come to a revolution in ideas. Now that's a very nice idea. If we change everybody's opinions first, of course, you don't need any problem. But what happens if the other side want to shoot them down? He said, oh, you're recruiting people to a bloodbath. Well, okay, so that's, so if they're shot down, you say, yeah, they were wrong, they shouldn't have resisted. They should have changed their ideas first. How do they change their ideas? Today, more than ever, and far more than when Marx was alive, the ruling class have far more at their disposal than mere repression. They have to use repression in certain cases. In the Soviet Union for years they've had to use it in the name of socialism, but they're gradually turning, they're gradually turning away from mass repression if they don't have to use it. If people are submissive, if people obey, if people do what they're told, obviously they don't need mass repression. It's a logical thing. And people talk about certain races being arrogant. Well, of course, in the case, that's not what creates war. What creates war is that when certain races are submissive, when they take what's told to them, and the majority of Russians have been conditioned by mass repression and by mass propaganda, but particularly by mass propaganda, to not particularly rebelling. And when people rebel, that isn't a revolution. I mean, it's only fools or ideologues who think that, they're agitators about calling people for a mass bloodbath, sort of let's come out and shoot a few policemen. But those people don't exist. I mean, that's imagination. There aren't people who are saying knock policemen's helmets off and that will cause a revolution. There are not people who are saying, well, if you shoot enough policemen, no more will come. There are not people who are saying, if we kill enough capitalists, capitalism will go. That doesn't exist. That's what journalists believe, but it's not serious. It doesn't exist. But what does happen, of course, is that you can't bring a revolution about. You can't bring a social revolution about unless people are prepared to carry it through. Now, how are they going to be prepared to carry it through? Only by being resistant to the evils of capitalism. Now, he pretends he's got a monopoly on resistance to capitalism. Only the Socialist Party of Great Britain believes that the capitalist class is ruling things and the capitalist class has control of the monopoly of production and so on. Well, of course, he knows perfectly well that's not true. But they don't even have, what they don't have is any determination to resist capitalism. When for instance, Mr. Murdoch really spits in the eye of his workers and they object and they resist, well, of course, that isn't going to overthrow capitalism. You know that. But if they accepted it meekly, that would certainly entrench it very, very strongly. If people are prepared to be independent, they're not going to accept the dictates of capitalism. Ultimately, the notion that what they need is a good lecture in economics, and that's all. Well, when they've got that lecture of economics, they'll be superior and they'll be able to go and preach that to other people. It's rubbish. I mean, the SPGB know that better than anybody else because they've been producing generations and generations of people who've had all this indoctrination And what have they done? They've either, like Mr. Lester, finished up in the government, or they finish up in business, or whatever. They don't achieve anything. They simply go on perpetuating the old myth that they are able to give things to people. They are able to tell them what to do, and the world can be transformed by lectures in economics. It can't be. Only way it can be transformed is by people learning to become independent, learning that by struggling they can resist capitalism, and learning that they can take over the industry themselves. The vast majority of people that Wapping have spoken to, they're not interested in. They weren't interested in just the sort of the pyrotechnics of it, the sort of the fighting the policemen and all the rest of it. They were like the miners. Many of them believed previously that the police were an independent body which just there to preserve law and order. Now they know better. A lot of them believed that the capitalist was giving them work. Now they know better. But even if one supposes that all this was in vain, it wasn't caused by any particular group, any particular people. It was caused by the workers themselves, and it's the workers themselves who have to achieve a revolution, or it won't be achieved. The idea that they're a sort of sociology class that need explanations in order to pass their ultimate examinations is, I'm afraid, a fairy tale. When, of course, this notion that anarchism comes from a backward peasantry, agrarian economy, well, of course, this again is part of the sort of the common Marxist heritage, which goes throughout the world movements calling themselves Marxists, including all the Stalinists and Trotskyists and so on. They all repeat this story, which all comes, after all, from a period of about 1860 to 1880, when there was a struggle international between Bakunin and Marx, and Bakunin had the support of some of the countries that were more agrarian, and Marx had the support of countries that were more industrial proletariat. But when one says the support of countries, one must realise, of course, what does it mean? I mean, about 100 people representing each country, no more. And so this myth, perpetuates itself in Marxism, somewhat like the story of the Good Samaritan, because Jesus mentioned that one Samaritan. All Samaritans have to be good, you see, and this story persists even now. I mean, I'm sure there must have been millions of bad Samaritans over years, but they're all forgotten, you see. Samaritans are good because they're sort of encapsulated in one parable. Similarly, you see, sort of, even today when sort of the whole of China is under Marxism and South America is ruled by so-called socialists, well, still repeat, well, of course, the anarchists are basically a peasantry, and Marxism comes from the industrial proletariat. You see, if one says that the notion of socialism, which he's advocating, is different from the socialism that's been advocated by the dictatorships of the world and by part of the capitalist class, and afterwards part of the university curricula in some capitalist countries. If he says, well, this is different, it's very curious to note how many similarities there are in the theory, although admittedly there are differences in the practice. But then, of course, it's easier for them to be different in practice when they have no chance whatever of practicing it, because how are they going to achieve the revolution? They say revolutionary ideas. But, you see, for people to change their views in regard to capitalism means far more than just revising their notions of economics. People have to change their ideas about things like patriarchy. They have to change their views. And people are changing their views about things like patriarchy. People have to change their views about how they're living with other people, whether they regard people as better or worse because they have different nationalities. These are all things that they have to change. These are all things that are part of the struggle. Now, it's no use isolating one thing out of all these things and saying, it's no use saying that you've got to change your views on patriarchy, because that's got nothing to do with social revolution. Well, maybe it has and maybe it hasn't. But the point is that people only change their views by practice, by action, and by action one doesn't necessarily mean violent action, but by action certainly. When once they change their views, they have different approaches to what they read in the mass media. See this particularly in the miners' strike, don't you? I mean, who were after all more entrenched in the establishment, admittedly the sort of a labour establishment, than the miners? Who more sort of patriarchal than the miners? I mean, it was essentially a patriarchal society. But you saw during the strike how that radically changed, how women became aware of their consciousness, as women, how they entered the strike. They didn't, like in years ago, oppose it. They entered into it. They took over the leadership, practically. All these things happened during the strike. And it didn't happen because, they got a lecture saying they should go and do it. They did it out of their experiences, and out of their experiences came understanding. And that's why so many of them now think that perhaps the so-called socialists of the day, who said nationalism was a great thing and the Labour Ball was the finest achievement of the British working class and flew the flag over the pitheads, they think they were wrong. This struggle has changed their views. It has not been done solely by written propaganda. It's easy, of course, to go and pick things out and say, to take things out of papers and make them sound funny. It's very, very easy. I mean, it's so easy. It's sort of not worth one's while sort of trying to emulate it. But essentially, you see, if you're talking about revolution, social revolution, the change of the whole economic basis of society, you've got to talk about people knowing how to do it, which he says, yes, that can be done by lecturing, but no, it's got to be done by action. That's where we differ. Now, because the old bogey about violence, he's not really, nobody ever, or very few people ever believe in violence achieving something in the sense, that it's sort of a positive action. You sort of let's go and hit somebody over the head with an axe sort of thing. That's a way to get a revolution. A lot of journalists really believe that. But the thing is, what do you do when you're attacked by people who are determined to use violence? What do you do, for instance, if suddenly through the door the National Front burst in and started beating people up? We just stand there and say, well, of course, you don't understand the basis of modern society. You're, in fact, supporting the capitalist class which is oppressing you. And then look out with your head streaming with blood. I mean, that's not an intelligent approach. The reason why the anarchists keep getting saddled with these accusations of violence, because it all goes back to the French resistance of the 1880s. During the 1870s, after the suppression of the Paris Commune, the bourgeoisie went round with their police, with their armed guards, killing off 1 in 10 of every worker they saw. If they saw a woman with a box of matches in her handbag, she was shot for being an incendiary. People were shot coming out of work. And this was because the workers of Paris had dared to rise. They were overthrown by the military. And this, incidentally, wasn't advocated by the anarchists alone. Karl Marx as well claimed to support it, but apparently that was okay in 1817, wrong in 1936. But after this happened, after this repression happened, they were in a state of apathy and lethargy. The workers were in a state of apathy and lethargy. They felt it was impossible to fight back. That's when the anarchists started the individual resistance, when they started shooting off members of the bourgeoisie, throwing bombs in cafes and all that. And you see, the journalist or the politician will take this thing out of context and say, the anarchist Emile Henry threw a bomb in a Paris cafe. He said, a crowded cafe. Of course, it sounds horrible, doesn't it? But one thinks that this was full of bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie had just taken part in these massacres, and this was a way of hitting back. It gets a sudden difference. Now, actually, I work as a printer, actually, on a particularly right-wing newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. I saw a copy they wrote, I saw it going through, as it were, which said it was about anarchists in Carrara who wanted to raise a statue to Bresci, who shot King Umberto after he had ordered the killing of 20 textile workers. Now, when that actually finally appeared in the press, they missed out the article in 20 textile workers, and I'm sure that's been collected with some notes that Comrade Donnelly has. You see, how terrible, how absurd. Just killing the king for no reason. Probably thought you were going to get a revolution as well. They probably thought that would overthrow the country. But of course, you see, it's a vastly different kettle of fish when you look at the things objectively. And the point is, anarchism says that yes, there is a problem in overthrowing capitalism, that's what one should turn one's attention to. But in order to get the majority of people to do it, one's got to support them in every struggle they have against authority. Otherwise, they won't want to do it. Because nowadays the mass media have got such a hold on people's lives that it's impossible to answer that public opinion is mass-produced. I mean, the question of hanging or flogging or anything is a mass-produced thing. You can get the answers. You can get answers of sort of 70% people for hanging or for flogging only by means of concerted propaganda in the press. All the propaganda in the press is devoted to it. So it's not only the state one has to, only the capitalist one has to fight. It's also the state. It's also, of course, the media which is used for the state, and of course the police. Of course, they're recruited from the working class. At any rate, they used to be. I mean, nowadays they tend to come from slightly higher strata. But they're used quite positively by the state in order to enforce the legislation that it makes. Without them, Parliament just becomes a debating chamber. But without them, the people could simply walk in if they disliked a factory owner, printer like Mr. Murdoch. All they have to do is walk in and take his presses. But they're conditioned to say that, well, this is impossible. The police are there to make sure it's impossible. But that's why you've got to think in terms of not just overthrowing capitalism, not just overthrowing the state, and not just abolishing the means of repression, including the media, as it exists. But you also have to think in terms of supporting every struggle that goes on, providing it's moving towards that society. Otherwise, you're just talking sort of airy-fairy nonsense, and we'll be carrying on forever.
I didn't hear from my colleague in front here what he meant by anarchism. He didn't say that. He didn't. It's a debate where anybody can come in and listen. And I've come in and I've listened, and I don't know what you mean by anarchism at all.
Well, yeah, that's fair enough. I didn't talk about anarchism because we're supposed to be debating, you see, on how revolution can be achieved, and I mean, I didn't particularly just want to, in a sense, plug the anarchist line. I mean, anarchism is the idea of no government, but it arose in the working class movement to distinguish itself from those who thought that both that capitalism could be reformed and that the workers could take part in bourgeois government, and from those who felt that the working class could create a state of its own. it distinguished between them by saying that the working class didn't need the state, that if they took power, the state would vanish. Now, it's true, see, that when he talks about 57 varieties, well, not as many as 57, but the fact is that it is possible to take ideas and put them on a plaster pedestal and worship them and never do anything about it. And there is that type of bourgeois anarchism existing, one can't deny it. But that, I mean, when I talk about anarchism, I'm referring to the revolutionary type of anarchism, which believes in the class struggle and believes in opposing any form of imposition upon the working class, whether it's from the present capitalist class or whether it's from a new class or from any state at all.
Do you want to come back on that, or?
Well, there's so much to come back on, but I might immediately do that part of things.
Or perhaps in the later stage.
I mean, is there money in an anarchist state? Are there capitalists?
No, obviously. The whole point of anarchist society is that the capitalist state shall be overthrown.
Wages, when the workers work for wages.
Well, obviously, in an anarchist society, they wouldn't work for wages because there would be you see, wages are a method by the ruling class, so as it were, sort of apportioning the rewards to other people. And if people are in control, they don't need to apportion the rewards; they've got the whole cake, as it were. So obviously, wages is something that belongs to the capitalist system.
Will there be money?
Well, the same thing applies, doesn't it? In the question of money. I mean, after all, if you know wages, there could hardly be any money. You know. But you see, in a sense, that is something which belongs in the future, and perhaps in the, in the part of the marble statue that I'm referring to. You see, the essential thing is that the working class should take hold of the present system, disperse it piece by piece, including the money system, the wages system, the checks, the credit cards, everything else, and run the society the way they want to do it themselves, you see, without being dictated to by the ruling class.
The banks.
Well, the banks.
Got a few other hands like this.
Can I just follow on the gentleman on the left? Surely they must have an ultimate aim in mind for their ultimate state, and also will they have religion?
Well, we're not advocating a state. We're advocating the abolition of a state.
Or whatever sort of living you have, you must imagine what it would be like.
Right, we can imagine what it would be.
Encourage people to join you, surely.
Exactly, but one can sketch the idea of a future free society. And that, if you like, is the anarchist contribution to the class struggle in a sense. But, I mean, obviously you can't leave it at that, you have to take part in the struggle. And so whether there be religion, well, of course, if people want to believe in anything, I mean, they will do whether, they will do whether you want them to or not. I mean, people can believe in whatever they want, but obviously there wouldn't be any institutionalised religion. Because basically an institutionalised religion becomes as formidable an opponent, if it isn't already, it certainly becomes as formidable an enemy as the state, or indeed sometimes as the capitalist class.
Mr. Chairman, could I say something there? We were asked there, the first question was, what is anarchism? And the first reply to it was, well, I didn't deal with that, because what we were dealing with was another matter. And what is the other matter? How can a real revolution be achieved? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about how it can, so we don't have to talk about anarchism. I endorse that.
No,
because all you have to talk about when you talk about how can a real revolution be achieved is socialism.
Well, the Catholic Church is rather good on remarks like that.
Well, I must start going to chapel.
Yeah, one of the things that we worship God in our way. You worship God in you worship God in your way. We worship God in His way. That when they're talking of Christianity, they're not including Protestants and so on. I mean, you know all that sort of debating trick. I mean, basically, what we were talking about is how to achieve a revolution. And I was saying that the object of anarchism is not to impose the way that society should go, but to point it out, but to take part in the struggle.
I've had a number of people want to speak. This gentleman here was first.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, a question of both speakers, I think I'll briefly can. First of all, now to the black flag speaker. No, I noticed though, but in distinction to what the Socialist Party speaker was saying about the need for education and experience, understanding, etc. You were more stressing the need of supporting workers in struggle. And the term you used, Conrad, was that so that they shall learn independence. And I'm assuming, obviously, that you were seeing this independence which they learn from these struggles as leading towards self-organisation, in fact, towards an anarchist society, which probably wouldn't be too different from the society with Socialist Party. But what I'm asking you to know is, surely, very often struggles which workers and others engage in, which make them up their independence, don't develop towards the knowledge of freedom at all. So are you saying then that you would only support those struggles which would develop the kind of consciousness which you would see as being revolutionary? Then if a Socialist Party speak like that, over many years I've noticed that the Socialist Party appears to me, it may be just for reasons like that, but it appears to me a Socialist Party is more and more vague upon the crunch of workers having understood than organising politically and democratically. Now, years back, the Socialist Party always spelled out exactly what that meant. Having understood the need for a revolutionary change, then that democratic organisation would mean putting your cross on the ballot paper, which thereby, of course, implies that you regard at least a certain part of the state machine as being independent and not in the hands of the class controlling the state. Now, I'm asking the Socialist Party speaker, do you still stand by that? Do you still stand by the cross on the ballot paper as being the only way?
Do you want to answer first, Albert? Then the question that was directed to you.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the point is obviously we do support every struggle. In one sense, you see, one doesn't quite know how to say this. Obviously, there are certain struggles that one wouldn't support. You know, I mean, there are struggles, sometimes disputes which are definitely reactionary. The struggle is there. You come forward and support it. You can't just stand aside and say, well, of course, you know, this is all wrong theoretically, you know, that you know, this will end in disaster, you know. So the best thing is not to do anything. I mean, obviously, one does one's best as one sees the circumstances. You know, the item from the Socialist Standard, which is saying, well, you see, the military in Spain have risen. They're causing the deaths of thousands of people. They're going to shoot them anyway, because when they got into power, they shot 1 in 10. But I mean, it doesn't affect any other country. It doesn't affect us, and really, it's a pity it ever happened. You know, but I mean, that's not an attitude that I regard as relevant.
Well, very simply on that one. We live in a coercive society. The only purpose of production today is to make a profit. So people with all sorts of ideas can exist. But socialism, unlike a coercive society, is one based in cooperation. Unless a majority of men and women in the working class agree to cooperate, to produce to the best of their ability, and take according to their needs, then socialism is not on the agenda. You can't get socialism unless you've got understanding. Now, when we say, how do you express that? Well, one of the best ways to know if a majority of people in this hall are in favour of having another pint, of going home, unless they want to vote with their feet, of course, as Lenin said, or if they want to do this, support that, or support the next thing, it's to count them, isn't it? I mean, how else would they know? ESP, it's only one way to do it. One of the best ways to do it is in a poll, isn't it? What do you say? What are you in favour of? Friend, what are you in favour of? You oppose that, you oppose that. Yes, we think the only way to do it is democratically. So we're in favour of that. And all our meetings are democratic. And all our decisions are democratic. On the question of Parliament, in those countries where you have workers have attained the right to vote for working class candidates as opposed to supporters of capitalism, we say the opportunity is there for you to organise, as the local branch are doing here, to contest an election, not quite frankly to win the next election, but in order to propagate our case. But eventually, of course, to build up that growing consciousness, to eventually take hold of that state machine. Because, let's face it, for workers to endorse the ideas about we'll just blindly struggle without really knowing what we're after, it's like two armies fighting. One knows exactly what they want to do, and the other's full of people that are not sure what they want to do. Some of them want to do opposite things. A good example was shown in Spain, where the government troops were fighting with one another. So, in other words, we stress understanding, we stress democracy, and we stress the fact that you cannot leave the state machine in the hands of the owning class. Now, today in this country, it's controlled through Parliament, and workers every 4 or 5 years go along and endorse it, and support it, and abide by it. Now, what we want instead is a revolution in which they will get rid of that apparatus. What they'll do instead is they'll take hold of that, they'll show that they are the majority, and they'll force that through that piece of legislation of declaring illegal the whole concept of private property and everything that goes with it. Now, once that happens, there is no need anymore. Once you've got a society based on common ownership, where there are none of these class conflicts, you've got no need for a state machine. But we definitely stress, got to be democratic, it's got to be understanding, and no, don't take part in every stupid struggle. Why? Struggle by all means, and every one of us has got to do it as a member of the working class. We've got to. We can't opt out of class struggle. Every day, wish we could, Christ. We used to go on holiday to try and get away from it and find we're bang in the middle of it and we'll get skinned again. Now, the proposition we ask you to do is know what you're fighting, and the best way to fight it, not engaging every time that the mill guy on my mother's society's upset about cutting welfare, but and say, right, we'll go down to the American embassy and picket them. We'll go down and terrify the Chilean janitor down in the embassy somewhere. I mean, that's pointless activity. What we want you to do is not give you a lecture in economics, but speak to you and discuss with you about the real world you live in and the real problems. Don't just hit out blindly and unknowingly.
And there was somebody, yes, that's right. There's somebody over there wanting to ask a question. Do you still got a question to ask?
One of the points was on democracy. So, and then one of the 3 points that I had to make was on democracy. I don't know whether nothing else to respond to that point about democracy, which is very important, especially in relation not only to political organisation, but how he foresees democratic organisation operating in the society that he wants. The way that socialists foresee that happening is a fairly logical outcome of the way that we're organised now. That's to say that we're organised democratically. And so the arrangement of this meeting, for instance, was the product of democratic discussion, democratic action. Now, if you take an anarchist line, you know, that you run up against one or two problems, not just about the organisation, political organisation in the society that we live in today, but I'd be interested to hear some comments about how an anarchist society operates along the lines of, where you decide to build certain things, how you decide to produce certain foods, how you decide to carry out certain very basic aspects of society without having democracy as the main pin of the way that society operates. But anyway, I'll leave that for one response. 2 other points. One of them on violence. A number of ideas very clearly put by Comrade Donnelly that just were left completely unanswered, that have been left unanswered up until now. The anarchist movement advocates violence. No, that's quite clear. We have an articulate reply from my left there in the word bullshit. If that's the total response to it, then I'll take it that the argument is very weak. I hope for a more eloquent reply from. Just still on this point on violence, I don't think that you do justice to the whole idea by giving the example that you did during your remarks about the NF. So what about the NF arrive at your door? Well, that's just surely a very small and trivial example. We're talking about the main way of expressing, putting across political ideas. We're not talking about some once-off little incident on a back door of the National Front turn up. That's a very minor thing. You're evading the question to stick to examples like that. Now, I'll leave it at those points.
Well, yeah. Yes, you are next. No, hang on, Albert. Do you want to reply to those questions?
Oh, okay. Well, I'll try and be brief as possible. I mean, first of all, of course, starting with the final question that it's a trivial matter if the NF come and beat you up. Well, I mean, it depends. Perhaps some people are masochists and probably like it, but I mean, to my mind, it's a very serious matter. If this happens, and it doesn't happen once or twice, is it? I mean, open your eyes, it's happening all over London. There's houses being burnt down on racial grounds and things like that. I mean, there are policemen hitting your head on truncheons. Now, when you say truncheons, hitting your head on the truncheon is no way to win a political argument, obviously you're right. I mean, nobody in their senses imagines that by hitting somebody on the head with a truncheon is going to make them anything but knocked out. But the point is, what do you do when somebody does it? Do you just stand by and let them do it? Or do you take action of one sort or another? And it's no good saying, and I can assure you from the Wapping picket line, it's no good saying to the policeman, I'm going to take my democratic right and vote against you in the next election, so you better be careful. I mean, that's not it. And when it comes to that general idea that parliamentarism somehow is equated with democracy, well, of course, just to use one's common sense, the capitalist class is enjoying a very high standard of living individually. The people associated with it enjoy a very high standard of living. The aristocracy, the royal family, everybody associated with them enjoys a high standard of living. The capitalist class is not going just very nicely to say, well, I'm sorry boys, that's it, we lost the election. I mean, they don't mind if Kinnock wins the election. They don't mind if if somebody else does. They don't even mind, basically. It might be a little inconvenient for some of them, but basically they don't mind if the National Front won the election. They wouldn't mind if somebody won the election and said, now we're going to get rid of you. And obviously they wouldn't accept it. And I think one's deluding oneself if one thinks they are going to do so. And briefly, you said something else, I can't read it. What was it? Democracy. Well, of course, democracy is a sort of a weasel word because it means so many different people. People talk about the democratic society and so on, but there is really no basic democracy in this country. There is one is able, within limits and provided one can afford it, the right to publish a free press. But if there were a real democracy, the workers who are running the newspapers wouldn't be disenfranchised. The readers who read them wouldn't be disenfranchised. The people who have the benefits of the free press are basically the people who own them. But they don't even, and in many cases, they don't even buy them. They take them over. Like Mr. Maxwell takes over the Daily Mirror as a mass influence upon the people of this country by something he never gave a penny for. He just juggle with on the stock exchange. So that, to hear oneself that this is all part of democracy, I'm afraid is, as far as the anarchists are concerned, is bunkum. And one can sort of talk and say, well, the meeting's organised democratically, well, of course it isn't. Meeting's organised by people who happen to be running the meeting, you know. I mean, it's not democracy. I mean, you know, it's a certain... True, you mustn't confuse free speech and democracy. They're not necessarily the same thing.
Alright, well, as a tyrant, I'll call the next person.
It's come up, actually, the case of Chile, when they did have a democratically socialist elected government trying to do all these socialist things like taking over the means of production. And for some reason, the ruling class had the audacity, with the help of the American CIA, to violently overthrow and lead many workers to their death in Santiago Stadium. Now, I can't see how anyone could vote in any kind of progressive council, government, whatever it is. When I voted Labour last time, because I happened to think, well, the SDP are really against squatting, I better vote Labour. I found out that the Labour Party now start cooperating with the police, publishing leaflets with them. So, I mean, I think two things happen when politicians that claim to be socialists get elected. They either get shot or they get corrupted, because of the capitalist class is so rich. It's got the SPG with all its guns and that. It's got all these other squads, MI5. There's all sophisticated technology, and all the socialists, all the left, right from you to the Labour Party, everything that does is print leaflets, organise strikes. They don't train people to defeat these things. I say, if you do have any intention of taking over the means of production, taking over your own factories, your own workplaces, taking over your own lives, I say you've got to actually force their hands. You've got to actually make sure that you can actually beat them with their own weapons, because otherwise you'll get shot. And to talk about this country that is a free country, when Rastafarians aren't allowed to practice their religion, when homosexuals have to wait till 21 before they can start leading a normal sex life, when all these other restrictions are placed on your lives in this country, and when these restrictions are becoming more and more severe, and as capitalism feels threatened, they'll try and divide people by making people anti-gay or anti-black or anti-Jewish or anti-gypsy. Some of these things at the moment are okay, like being anti-homosexual or being anti-gypsy is fine, but not yet totally being anti-black is fine if you're a political party like the Labour Party. You can't publicly say that, but it will come a time when that will be publicly the case. And if you don't realise what you're up against, I think you're being more dangerous than anything else. The only reason it's not dangerous is that because of their first defence, and their first defence is the mass media and the Sun and the Daily Mirror, which at the moment is working, because at the moment people seem to go along with the things they read in these papers. When that breaks down, well, then that's when the crunch comes.
Right, I want to get people's response
Well,
first.
I think there's a couple of important things. I mean, you're saying we're naive not to start learning small arms drill and nuclear bombs and that. You're accusing us of being naive. But you voted for the Labour Party and were shocked to hear that they support private property in the police. What? But unfortunately, friend, we've been saying that for a very long time, that the Labour Party stand for private property, and have shown in the past that they will support it. They supported both world wars. They were the ones that's in Britain who started the manufacture of the A-bomb. They're the ones in Britain that introduced peacetime conscription, and so on and so on. If you'd read the Socialist Standard, this naive party that refuses to start drilling its members, you'd have known that, and not voted for your gaffer, as you did. But you've learnt that. That's good. You've learnt something. But unfortunately, your ignorance meant that we had a Labour government or a Tory government or whatever government had at the time you voted. Now, the point about it is that what you obviously needed was what this man's decrying: socialist knowledge. If only you'd come along and found out about class division. If only you'd found out a little about economics and history. But apparently, you're still not going to go in, because you still think that there's a way out of this by workers attempting to overthrow the state machine by their own puny efforts in a military adventure. I mean, that's madness. That's all you can say about that one. It's no question of it's a little irrational or it's a bit strange. It's a nutcase idea. And I'll show you how nutcase it is. You suggest to anybody else in this room that tomorrow morning we go down to Hyde Park and I'll show you how to fire a Bren gun. You'd say, "Cop that, I'm not daft as that." I mean, you might get a few recruits, maybe about 11 o'clock down the stair, and guys are pissed out their mind. But you want to get a rational man doing it. And yet that's what you're suggesting to this naive party who suggest that knowledge, who suggest that knowledge is the only way out. But we don't take the viewpoint that's been proposed here of the National Front. See, this is a phony. This is like the conscientious objectors one. What would you do if a German tried to rape your sister? And of course, as Oliver Lipton said, he was a homosexual, try and impose my body between the two of them. That's a stupid idea. What he would do and what I would do, I wouldn't do what he imagines I was going to do. Give him a lecture in economics. I'd either run, which is more likely, if I thought I'd have a chance at bottle him. What would he do? Give him a lecture in anarchism, or run, or bottle him. He would do exactly as I would do. So forget that one. The Socialist Party aren't any more cowardly than him, or any more brave than him. But what we are is a wee bit flyer than him, a wee bit more up here when it comes to understanding the world we live in. Not that he's less intelligent or more intelligent.
Well, you've seen they didn't use guns to have a successful revolution in Nicaragua.
And that's another one. No, there was no revolution.
There's been a non-violent revolution that's ever been successful.
We've got some. Yes, this guy's been waiting quite a while.
A lot of what Malcolm Blackburn was talking about class, or maybe he wasn't talking about class. He was talking about the workers and how the workers in struggle have got to bring things about to happen. And he was going on about the bourgeoisie and the workers and something. I mean, where exactly do you stand on this point? I mean, you don't seem to sort of point in between. No, it's the workers, it's something. I don't know whether it's people who are at Wapping, or maybe it's people who read the Daily Telegraph or something. Who exactly and where and why and what do you stand? Where's your stand on the class issue?
Well, it seems to be the workers. I didn't see there was anything ambiguous.
Well, what are you talking about? If you want people to actually organise for change, or actually bring about change and do things, whether it's through your ways or whatever the Socialist Party says, then what people are you actually referring to when you say, I don't know, that people in the police are, well, what were you saying? You said, well, they're not workers, they're some of them are sort of...
I said some come from the higher strata these days.
How can you tell that? How can you tell that? How do you...
Well, that was,
who do you mean by who do you mean when you talk about working class? Who exactly do you mean?
I mean by the people in working class are the people who are producing the economy of the country.
So how many people sort of joking that is in your I don't know. I've got no idea how many workers there are in this country, but to my mind, it seems so perfectly simple. I don't know what you mean heavy weather about it. But the working class is basically the people who are producing and all the people, in fact, who are being suppressed by the capitalist system, who are being held under by the monopoly on production and distribution. Okay, well, who are the bourgeoisie then?
Basically, the bourgeoisie are the profit-making owners in society. I don't accept the fact that...
Who are the ruling class?
The ruling class in this country are the property owners and and landowners integrated into the state.
So is there any difference between the bourgeoisie and the...
Well, I don't want us to get down to interrogation, you know. From
Give them back in the dictionary or something.
So, no, there's somebody behind you first, and there's somebody. Then, okay, there's the guy in the back there first.
Well, there's just 2 points I'd like to make, short ones, and that is, there's a factor in society that no one seems to, well, they neglect it more or less. The fact that when they say about the struggle to solve the problem of socialism, and we've got no chance against the power of the state and all that, but there's a factor working in the background in an evolutionary process, and that is our ally. The development of capitalism is pushing workers towards what we're saying. They cannot control this, the capitalists. It's out of hand. they're finding their arguments more and more bankrupt. As the day goes by, they're looking for new ideas, and you listen to them, they're all saying the same thing that they said when I was a boy. I'm now an old one. Same bloody story as it was in the 20s and 30s. For a start. But capitalism is developing. It's not static. It's an part of the evolutionary process. So that is our ally. And all these so-called revolutions that our friends talking about have nothing to do with socialism. To do with death and destruction and people fighting for the wealth of the planet and the exploitation of you and me, the workers in every country on this planet. That's what it's all about, so don't lose sight of the fact you've got an ally. Capitalism. It cannot solve the problems, it can only intensify them. So keep working and talking.
Well, there was somebody here wanting to make a contribution. Then I'm going to this guy here.
Well,
then that bloke.
What I would like to say to Albert Meltzer, first of all, to deal with his his battle against the National Front. And you always notice people are very courageous about battles against the National Front, either before they've happened or after they've happened. In fact, if you've got any sense, if you see the National Front coming into a meeting, the first thing to recognise about the National Front is not that they're strong, but that they're stupid. What characterises the National Front is their profound and almost unique stupidity. And therefore, when the National Front enters into a meeting, all you're seeing is a microcosm of the police force, the army, and much bigger battles that you've got to fight against. And if you're going to start with one bunch of thugs, then you've got to fight every bloody thug that you're going to find in the world. And every time there's a war, you're going to have to engage in it and fight these thugs. So if you are in Iran or Iraq, you would have to be fighting against both armies at once. If you are in Ireland, you would have to be fighting against the thugs of the British Army and the thugs of the various other terrorist organisations all at the same time. Now, it's all very well sitting around in a room in Islington in a pub making macho speeches about fighting and action and violence. But violence is a dirty, sickly, obscene business. And anyone who is talking in favour of a society where we're not going to have violence and killing and murdering one another because of power ought to not sit around hedging about and making glamorous sounding and glorious brave noises like Albert Meltzer. You ought to get up and say, we are not prepared to have anything to do with violence. Violence is against what we stand for. And the way you deal with someone who's stupid and strong is you don't beat him up. Because if you try to beat him up, he will win the fight. The difference between socialists and fascists is that fascists are strong and stupid, and socialists tend to be weak and clever. Therefore, you beat them in an argument, not in a fucking fight. Secondly, I would suggest to Albert Meltzer that he answers the question, is a society without government and armies and all of these other institutions going to come about as a result of a majority understanding and wanting it or not? Are we going to have to wait until there's a majority, or are we going to be able to get this new society with a minority? If we can get it with a minority, why not have it now? Why not hold a vote in this room now? Who's in favour of a society without government, without army, without war, and without all of this other obscenity? We're all in favour. Go out in the streets. We'll have it. The fact of the matter is, if you've got to get a majority to understand and want it, I don't know whether that's what Albert Meltzer thinks, then you have got to change their ideas. And the final question I want to ask Albert Meltzer is, what is this pathetic sort of nonsense about, well, even if you get a majority, and even if the vast majority of workers understand and want socialism, want to do away with our bosses, want to do away with a buying and selling system, want to do away with the power of money, but the capitalists won't let you, he says. After the election, when the vast majority of people have told Neil Kinnock to go and put it where he should have put it years ago, Margaret Thatcher to stick her head in a gas oven, Owen and still tie themselves together and jump in a river. The vast majority of workers have made this conscious decision, and then, you see, the capitalists are going to come out. Prince Edward is going to come out of Buckingham Palace, because we all know he's a tough guy. He's been in the Marines for a week. And he's going to say, well, you can't have it. And all these people who are going to be beating the National Front up, they're all going to say, oh, shit, we can't have it. Oh, well, we'll have to think of another way. It's quite obvious. Once the vast majority of workers understand and want socialism, the capitalist class, whether they like it or not, are going to have to accept either that they abide by the majority decision, or alternatively, they live the kind of life of suffering that most of us are living at the moment.
Do you want to... Does the two speakers want to respond to these questions now? Shall I take other questions and then respond? I think we've got to.
We must take other questions. I'll deal with that.
Sky want to. And then...
Can I ask a personal question? What's the
well,
life you live in now then? You might bring down a personal issue.
Fucking terrible.
Or can you actually be more explicit about it?
Okay, if you want a private discussion, you can always...
There's been lots of personal issues, like the question about the NF, farms, things like that. I think it's a bit confusing when you jump between personal things, complications that people have. We have lots of problems with the NF. I agree with problems. I know you can abstract these things so they're not problems, right? If people think problems, they are problems. And if you're going to talk about, live people then, and they're going to use those personal motives, I think they should defend them. Otherwise, they use it as a form of language, which I think is highly emotional. I'm not prepared to be swayed by it.
You win them over. Win them over.
I didn't answer that question.
Okay, well yes.
He's made this comment about shit like. What is it like?
Yes. All right. I know. I understand. I appreciate your point. But the thing is, we've got other people who want to make questions. If you put it this way, if you want to ask this guy here that question, you can ask him. Go outside and ask him, or ask him when the meeting's closed, because there's other people that want to make the question. But the point is, if you was waiting now to put a question, and someone else was making that point that you was making, you would say, "Oh, look, this fucking bastard! I want to say a question now." So, if you want to put that question, put that another time. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying you shouldn't say that. What I'm saying to you, if you want to do it, you can do it.
Well, I'll ask you a question, friend. It's a simple one. How he lives is a pathetic life of wage slave. That's why he's a member of the Socialist Party. Well, I'll not tell you about the rest of his life, because it's boring to him. It'll be doubly boring to you. Now, the other thing about it is, we're not evading any issues. The point is, it was raised here, what would you do if a National Front guy came along? I thought I'd answered that on behalf of the Socialist Party. Exactly the same. And I'll answer your question now, I'm on my feet. I forgot about Chile. Chile was not a socialist revolution. Didn't have a majority in favour of him, by the way. It had absolutely nothing to do with it. And you might as well say, how did any government get thrown over by foreign investors? But the guarantee that socialism will work is when socialism comes about, it will come about by the conscious action of understanding workers. Now, that's a difference. That's a guarantee that socialism will work. That the majority will understand and be prepared to make it work. This is not just a question of a minority government forming where an intellectual calls himself a Marxist and tries to nationalise certain concerns. Nationalisation's got nothing to do with socialism. Reforms have got nothing to do with socialism. Socialism is about transformation of society brought about by a conscious, understanding majority.
I'm not answering questions.
Well, what question have I not answered?
I'm over there.
Which one? It's easy to make spheres. Which one have I not answered?
Well, I believe you didn't answer the questions he was asking.
Which one? What would you do if a National Front man came to you? I said I'd do exactly the same as that speaker. I'd either hit him, or run, or bleed all over him. No difference between us. But what we do about the real violence in the world is we organise with our fellow workers, men and women of the working class, to get rid of a society that breeds violence. Don't expect people to become choir boys and Michelangelos in a society like capitalism. I walk through the streets of Glasgow. I don't expect young boys at the corner to be talking about Anagoni or Van Gogh or Rembrandt or anything like that. I expect them to shout, "Buck me a bass," and come out with a chip. Because that's the kind of violent, kind of society we've got. Because we live in a society based in competition and violence. What we're seeking is one based in cooperation and understanding.
Right, now, thanks for waiting, by the way.
Okay, one of the points that has been mentioned briefly is the situation with regard to Wapping, which is the, well, we know what that is, it's the sacking of workers that were producing certain newspapers, one of which was, of course, the Times, and another one was the Sun, and I think the other one was Sunday Express or one or two, possibly. And I also understand in connection with that the comrade from the Black Flag is involved in producing the Daily Telegraph. Now, with regard to the situation at Wapping, I understand that for about the last years, workers have been going to Wapping because they want their job back to produce, to continue producing the Times, the Sunday Times, whatever that other silly thing called the Sun, another thing called the Express, and comrade from Black Flag, he's involved in producing another newspaper, and whether or not the merits of producing that newspaper, which may be debatable, but certainly with regard to producing things like the Sun and the Express and one or two other things that Murdoch may well be producing, they actually spent a year trying to get their job back, certainly to produce a real bundle of rubbish called the Sun, which if not, certainly won't give you any knowledge. If you read it, every single letter, every single word for one year, you still won't know anything. You have been served up a daily load of garbage of a demented nature. So therefore, my basic question is, why would, and I would like a response from the Black Flag on this point, why would the people be so determined to go to Wapping with the chance of getting their skull smashed in order to get their job back to produce such a load of awful garbage? Yes.
Respond to that afterwards, Albert.
Yeah, I know they need the money.
Okay. Well, I'm going to get Albert to respond to these questions afterwards, and social speakers, of course. Yes, this guy has been waiting.
One specific question really I'd like to ask Albert. I've always felt that the question of violence was a very sad anomaly in the whole anarchist philosophy. And it seems to be, it's true, and I speak as a sort of anarchist, it is true that the non-violent and pacifist tradition in anarchy is not the mainstream of anarchic action. And it is something that has always puzzled me. And I've been very disappointed to see the way in which the violence has become debated at such a personal level about national fronts of people beating up your grandmother. Because it's quite clearly two completely different spheres of action. If somebody bursts into my house and threatens my children, I am not in a rational circumstance in which I can make a politically judged response. I'm going to act as a human being in an irrational circumstance. It is a very different thing to fail to come up with a clear-cut political statement that rationally says that we deplore violence. And since anarchy is opposed to the state and identifies the state as the arch enemy, it has always disappointed me that so many anarchists cannot see that violence is one of the supreme and abiding tools of the state. And people who are fundamentally not violent, there is no proof of that at all, the violence is a glistening example of what can be produced by the kind of society we live in. It is the artificial thing, is the violence. And any political philosophy opposed to the state, opposed to capitalism, opposed to the way we live, it seems to me, when it speaks rationally and not in a personal, unfortunate circumstance, must be unequivocally, in my view, opposed to violence. And it disappoints me that anarchists have hedged that issue.
Certainly, yes. In the background.
Just, Comrade Chairman, Albert Melton, in his address, earlier on, said that workers learn by experience. And the experience I think he was talking about was strikes, confrontations with the police on picket lines and so on. And he went on to say, but that's not the whole thing. It's not just economic questions that the workers have got to come to grips with. They've got to learn, for example, about patriarchy and matriarchy. And presumably they've got to learn about history and about anthropology and all sorts of other things. Now, I've had 50 years as a trade union representative arguing the case with employers about wages and conditions, in fact, economic arguments. And I don't remember one occasion when a worker who's taken part in that confrontation one way or the other has come to me and said, I've learned a lot. I know all about matriarchy and patriarchy and biology. Not one. The fact is, of course, that I'm not decrying the fact that that kind of knowledge is necessary, but you don't get that knowledge on the picket line. If you want to understand about working class history, or history per se, or about anthropology and all the rest of it, you've got to learn. You've got to do it yourself. And that is part of the education that socialism offers. Got nothing whatever to do with the picket line or of a strike or anything else. That's the learning that comes from trying to get to grips with the situation as a whole.
Somebody wanted to ask a question.
I'd like to know that, actually similar to what that guy over there was saying, that anarchists, how they equate the support for armed struggle really with wanting a society without leaders and without sort of coercion. And guy over there, I don't know if he's an anarchist or a Leninist, but he supports various sort of Latin American left-wing struggles, which definitely are not. They have got leaders, they have got hierarchies, they are coercive, and they're not revolutionary. I can't see the difference between them and the acting government, really. It's the same sort of idea, just with violence thrown in. And I'd like to remind people that in Nicaragua they've got conscription, and this is something that people opposed when the Labour government brought it in.
I would oppose conscription. Conscription in Britain is conscription for capitalist fodder to go around and get themselves killed for the name of them.
I would like the speakers
when
to.
You've got the Americans bombing your crops in the form of the conscience. Well, of course you've got to have it. Of course you've got to defend your crops. Otherwise, somebody's going to smash your crops and blow them up, and you're going to be hungry and starve, and your socialism's gone. And back to the old days.
I would like the speakers to reply to that. Now I'm going to take one more question and then have the two speakers wind up. Okay.
We've heard a lot from the SPG about the forms of organisation which they think workers should organise in order to take over the society we have. I'm a member of the same organisation which Albert belongs to, which is the Direct Action Movement, of which Black Flag is one paper. The Direct Action Movement is the British section of the International Workers' Association, which is the Anarcho-Syndicalist International, which the CNT in Spain, which we've heard about, belongs to, which unions in lots of countries belong to. And our perspective is that we believe the organisation of the working class should be the economic organisation of the working class, and after the revolution, to answer all these questions we've heard, that the economic organisations of the working class are the organisations which administer the revolution, not the state political organisations, which is what I seem to be hearing from the SPGB. I wonder what the SPGB would say to the anarchist, anarcho-syndicalist assertion that only the economic organisations of the working class can truly represent the workers, that is the unions, not the state parties.
Okay, right, I'm going to call on Albert first of all to sum up, and then Dick to sum up, then we'll adjourn. Okay.
Well, of course, I've got proof of the fact that the media generally is part of the force of repression when you see, despite what I said, and I mean whether I'm clear or not, I don't know, but question after question is brought up, this question of violence, and always associate anarchism with violence, and what a sad anomaly it is, and so on, and it was said that, it's practically suggested that sort of standing up advocating the Holocaust, I should think, I mean, and this criticism is made of anarchists constantly by every authoritarian government. I mean, you wouldn't think that anybody could have bloodier hands than the Russian government, but they'll use a question about anarchism and violence. The Nazis, exactly the same thing. They all accuse the anarchists of violence. And it all goes down to the fact, brings us back to the fact of these 10 years after the Paris Commune, when, after all, a movement representing the workers was crushed by the bourgeoisie. The SPG would have stood aside, but actually Marx supported them. The workers were crushed by they had established, at any rate, working class presence in the administration of Paris. They were crushed by the bourgeoisie. After the crush of the bourgeoisie, the anarchists decided to hit back. But they decided not to hit back in the way that the RA do today, by indiscriminate bombing, which is something a nationalist would do, because after all, if this thing was done in France, or everybody in French is guilty, if it was done in Germany, everybody in Germany is guilty. They didn't do it indiscriminately, they did it discriminately. They simply shot leading members of the ruling class and prominent people. Kings, queens, presidents, members of the capitalist class individually for their specific crimes. Now, that may be a very shocking thing. I mean, you may regard that as horrible. But when you think in terms of numbers, I mean, it's not the amount that the capitalist class kill in one single day of people whom they regard as having transgressed the modes of capitalist conduct. But it's, as I say, it's preserved out of sort of in amber, like flies in amber. This legend is preserved year after year, and it's always fought against anarchists by every brand of Marxist. Anarchists believe in violence. Anarchists believe in violence. Now, anarchists don't believe in violence any more than anybody else does. I mean, to my mind, a person who believes in violence is and of course everybody's got their own ideas, it's another weasel word. It's somebody with an axe that goes around indiscriminately hitting people on the head. That's not anarchism, obviously, and it's something quite different. But now there are people who are absolute pacifists who say no violence at all. I mean, just fighting a policeman is equivalent, equally as bad as the Holocaust. Any form of violence is bad. Well, 99% at least of people reject that, including anarchists. I mean, there may be some anarchists who are not absolute pacifists, the majority reject that. But what we say is it is part of capitalist society, and if struggles take place which are regarded to necessitate violence, or in which action has been taken against them and fought against them, we support it. And we certainly don't condemn it, even if it's foolish. I mean, the Labour Party is great on denouncing what's happening at Wapping, simply because, if anyone says it has nothing to do with us, because they're frightened of what's going to happen in the next election. That might reflect to them electorally. But we have no such preoccupations, and our consideration is solely regarding the workers themselves. The reason why the workers at Wapping are fighting to, as you say, because that's a typical smear. All the workers are just fighting to preserve their jobs, well that's true, and look at the shit they're producing. Well, it has to remind me of the lavatory attendant who said it may be shit to you, but it's bread matter to me, but that's is there anybody apart from the printers who's producing something worthwhile Is it the motor car industry, the armaments industry, the nuclear industry? I mean, who are the workers that are producing anything worthwhile? Obviously, they're
Some
not.
people are producing toilet rolls.
Yeah.
You mean you don't want a toilet roll?
True. I mean,
I think it does.
well, they're only producing toilet rolls because somebody can make a profit out of them. If it was solely a question of a public service, I can assure you that, I would have to fall back on the grass once again.
The crap on the grass.
I can't think of what the question was. On the question of, what was it? Yes, you see, it was very, but when one comes back onto this question of democracy, so again, democracy, like violence, it means apparently whatever you want it to mean. Basically, democracy should imply that you have an actual hand in something, that you actually run something from below upwards, and not from above downwards. Now, you cannot say, in my mind, that Britain is a democratic society. It just isn't. There is free speech allowed, but then to a certain extent, many countries allow free speech without any pretense of being democratic, and free speech can go equally well with a situation where you've got the utmost repression. I mean, there are many. You can have the most violent repression and still have free speech. Is absolutely essential. But the question is, how can you make your feelings effective? I mean, that is really what makes it democracy. Now, of course, you said, well, of course, it's quite simple. You sort of you put your cross on the ballot paper when you've got the majority of people with you. Then you've won. You see, you pass the post and you've won. But obviously, the capitalist class won't accept it, and don't run away from that by debating trick and say, what are these people who were so brave in fighting the police going to run away? Well, of course, these presumably would not be the police who are brave in fighting the police. These were the people referred to as weak and stupid, weak and clever. I mean, if it should be, which of course it obviously never will be, if it should be that the Socialist Party succeeded in getting to the point of the ballot where they got past the post, I'm sure the capitalist class would step in. Now, it could well be that then the working class would take action, but they would take vastly different action from what's proposed, which is, basically, what is it? Just the idea, the revolution in ideas and the marking the cross on the ballot post, nothing more. Obviously, there's got to be something more. Obviously, in my mind, you've got to have a struggle that you've got to have a continuing struggle. And, oh yes, the other point was, of course, people don't learn, and of course the other debating trick you extend it, they don't know patriarchy, matriarchy, biology and anthropology, how to trade union struggles. Of course they don't. But when trade union struggles are translated into action, not the negotiating chapter, when they're negotiating into action, people do realise certain things. You take communal kitchens in the miners' strike. You take the role of the women in the miners' strike. Those are things translated into action. I certainly know from that.
Okay. You want to wind up?
Well, a friend's talking about a few debating tricks and that, but here's a beauty. I talked about 57 varieties of anarchists, and he then went on and told us about 5,700 varieties of socialists. But that shows that although I only had 3 black flags, he must never have read the Socialist Standard, because in every issue of the Socialist Standard it points out, of course there's no copyright. Now tomorrow he could call himself socialist. He could. Nobody's stopping him. And of course there are people who have done it who have got nothing to do with it. And of course what we've got to do is point that out. But they produced a paper where they talked with black flags, and it's called Anarchists in Britain. And it then gives you not just one or two, but quite a bundle of them, and tells you about how they all differ from one another, but still calls them anarchists. And so I think I'm justified in saying that my opponent recognises a large variety of these, some of which he doesn't agree with. For instance, he doesn't agree with the group under the heading Freedom Press. For one, I can not go through them all, but all these wee groups, he's got differences. I'm assuming that he's got this viewpoint. That's all I can assume. So it's a debating trick to say that we call Hitler a socialist, and Mussolini a socialist, and Kinnock a socialist. If he'd read one socialist standard, and I think he's read one, he would have got away from that idea. So he wasn't being completely honest with us there, unfortunately. Now, the most important item, as far as I'm concerned, about the whole thing, is our friend has taken this viewpoint that understanding is unimportant, or that understanding can only come by the struggle. In fact, I actually said towards the end there, the struggle goes on and on and on. What a prospect! We're always going to have it. Despite our best efforts, there will be the millennium, millions of years from now, we'll still have these horrible... Presumably, we are here discussing and thinking, and presumably in our life we discuss and think and read about the world we live in and how best to deal with the major problems that confront us as human beings, as workers, as socialists, or any, no matter how you look upon yourself. We've got to do that. And nobody suggests at any time that what you do is you just blindly struggle against a problem. You know, if the light goes off, you don't go up and smash the bulb and say, "Get on, you bastard," do you? You say, "Well, wait a minute, I better read this wee book," or ask the man next door, "Do you know anything about fuses and all the rest of it?" In your normal life you do it. I'm sure he does it as well. And he doesn't glorify the struggle. He doesn't do that. I think, what a bloody nuisance it is. So, what we're proposing, I think, is a sensible... You might disagree with it, of course, but I think it at least is based on rationality. You live in a society that's got certain problems. The cause of them, we claim, other people claim there's other problems, but we claim that the cause of them is the nature of the society you live in and how it's organised, the class structure. Our proposal, there's hundreds of proposals, but our proposal as a political party, because we're not here just as a wee debating society, is that men and women of the working class should consider that. If they agree with us, join with us. And now I come to this question of violence. Socialists take the viewpoint that we can establish socialism without using violence. But of course, we're not so naive to imagine that there won't be some people, I don't suggest Prince Edward or that, but some people even more backward than him, who will take the viewpoint that, okay, I'm up and at them. I have in mind some of those bampots that go around putting bombs and blowing up wains and all the rest of it, and the Honest Lodge and the IRA and all over the world, these madmen in Iraq and Iran, who want to die. They want to die. They're looking forward to dying to get to heaven or Valhalla or wherever. Right, if society is at that stage when a majority of the industrialised working class opt for socialism in the countries that are democracy, then we'll have to deal with the problem. And if it is, of course, that a minority attempt to use arms to overthrow the wishes of the majority, we're not going to take this pacifist viewpoint. Oh, sorry, there's one madman running about, so we can't have it. What we will do is if they try and kill us, we'll kill them. But that's different from advocating a policy of violence. What that's saying is there's a reason we want to get hold of that state machine. Number one, so they don't have it. So they don't make a bloodbath out of us like they did in the Paris Commune. And what my opponent says is quite right there. Just to crazy revenge on the working class indiscriminately. No, we say that that's because they captured the state machine. Rather unique circumstances, I may add. It's more a national law than a civil law. That what we're concerned about here is that, yes, we will use violence if the majority in favour of socialism capture the state machine and try to administer a socialist society, because there'll no longer be governments, and an attempt is made by a recalcitrant minority taking up arms, yes, reluctantly, we'll have to deal with them as best we can. And if the worst comes to the worst, kill them. We don't mince about it. That's it. We're not going to sacrifice ourselves and generations of workers to live in this nightmare because of a band of madmen. No intentions of doing that, nor do we attempt to hide our viewpoint towards them. However, knowing the present capitalist class, no, personally of course, but knowing their wonderful, courageous record, it's not them I fear. What I fear is backward workers there, and it may be possibly the case. But nevertheless, there is no way we can get to that stage on a policy of violence. Violence may be thrust upon us at a later stage. There's no way we can change ideas. As someone said, and my opponent agrees. You don't change people's ideas of violence. But violence is not the big issue here. The big issue here is understanding and class ownership. Now, I claim, and a bombastic claim, you may think, but I will get evidence, and it's up to you to search out and read our literature and see if it is a bombastic claim, that through those years of existence, this party and its sister parties elsewhere have not got socialism, not got revolution, but what we have done is we've made very clear, very important points that workers who have rejected them or who never heard of them have lived to rue the day they didn't, or in some cases died. For instance, socialists didn't take the viewpoint, oh, the capitalist class want us to go to work, we'll go to work. Or the authorities say that. Don't get this idea of the noble anarchist and the feeble, weak socialist. It's not the case. I assure you it's not the case. What happened is when the war broke out in 1418, 39-45, and all the other hundreds and hundreds of conflicts that left-wingers and various other groups were telling us to support, we said to workers, no. And the outcome of all those conflicts, no matter which side of the owning class, either inside a country or in another country won, the world's working class lost. Democracy was never saved by the 1914, 18, 39, 45, the Spanish or any of these other conflicts. So we at least have got this one, that our case has stood the test of time. Unfortunately, wish it hadn't. Wish in 1905 the world's working class had been mature enough to say, this is it, this is the answer, let's organise. Now, unfortunately, speaking at a meeting can't do that. Can't deal with people whose whole history is different from it. But nevertheless, unless you're into mysticism, you've got to assume that to have a revolution, you've got to have conscious people who know what they're doing. I mean, where else can we go? If you're saying there's some magic about it, then it finishes as a public debate. It becomes a seance. The people of Spain instinctively felt, the workers at the Kronstadt, and I mean, that's just garbage. People thought about their actions. Quite often the results of their actions were the opposite of what they thought they would be, of course. That's the nature of living in a world such as we do. But nevertheless, no one suggests any revolution can come about, surely, other than it is conscious, other than it's been thought about, other, in the case of the socialist revolution, it's backed up with socialist knowledge about the history and the economics of the society they live in. Now, anybody to suggest other than that has been foolish, I suggest, but of course it's up to you to make your mind. Because there is a romance about that, the streets running with blood. Christina Powell used to use that. He was talking about Paris Commune. But all this stuff, and it is great, isn't it? As you go back to your wee bed sit the night and that, and think, oh, I struck a blow for the international anarchist movement. But all of them, I'm sorry, I missed out one of the guy's contributions here, about the syndicalist viewpoint, or the CNT's viewpoint, and all that. I see they went to court to protect their name, by the way, which shows how much they think of legality. But anyway, the proposition that we would say that the whole of history shows that the syndicalist movement, or all different varieties of the anarchist viewpoint, have missed the boat, because they've never stressed understanding. They've always stressed this romantic emotionalism, which is doomed to failure, against a state machine that's steeped, and its whole history reeks of the blood of the working class. So if you seriously consider this debate, I hope that if you come away from this meeting, I'm not suggesting you don't read a black flag, read everything, but you pay more serious attention to a case that I believe is more scientific than that of the anarchists.